We're joined by Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick, Brooks Spector. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, let's first talk about what Russia has available in its chest of armor if it's going to take counter-sanction moves and threats. What does it have available to make an impact to Europe, but the United States?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. There are very few products that Russia exports to the world that aren't available elsewhere. Although, obviously, when certain sources of supply disappear, it puts upward price pressure on the supplies from other places. But if you look at Russian exports, primarily it's natural gas, it's oil, or petroleum, as we usually call it. It's a number of other minerals and metals, such as manganese and some chromium. Not chromium. But what's the other one? Platinum and weapons. Those are its main export earners, and to the extent to which it blocks, if it can, exports of these, that's obviously a two-edged sword. If you don't export a product, you don't earn anything from the product. And at this point, with an offensive military campaign on the go, Russia would need every penny, every kopeck it could earn. Now, the problem for the Russians now, of course, is that they are increasingly locked out of the international financial system. It's going to be very hard for them to receive payments from many countries. It's certainly going to be very hard for them to make payments to other countries because they are, among other things, blocked out of the SWIFT system. That's not something many people pay much attention to, but it's the mechanism by which your bank makes a payment on your behalf to another bank overseas and ultimately to a customer or a client. And usually that goes very smoothly and you don't notice it, but when you can't use it or when you're not able to access it, suddenly things are frozen.
Okay. Now, we know that Russia is the biggest exporter of grain. Much has been spoken about it, the impact on food price inflation and supply chains, but it's also banned exports of fertilizer due to shortages on the domestic market. But apparently, European farmers have already been hit hard by this, who are dependent on that fertilizer. Russia being a major producer of PGM metals, as you mentioned, some of them including nickel exports. So are you saying that there'll be little impact should it make good on its threat, including that of shutting down natural gas?
No, I didn't say there'd be very little impact. I said that there is, in almost all those cases, there are alternative sources of supply, but there certainly will be upward price pressure on some of them. Russia produces a great deal of grain, but Ukraine does too. Ukraine is the fourth largest exporter of grain as a commodity in the world. And to the extent to which its exports are disrupted because it's being invaded or its ports are destroyed, is the extent to which that many African or Middle Eastern or South Asian countries are affected. And it isn't because of Russia. In that case, it's because Ukrainian grain exports aren't available to go out. But remember, right now is the early part of the planting season in a place like Russia or Ukraine. It's still winter in those countries. There are alternative sources of grain, of course. Canada, the United States are large exporters, Argentina, Australia, and in some years, South Africa as well. So it's impossible to argue that there will be no impact, but it is also possible, depending on the markets, to argue that the impact is manageable for most commodities. A lot of the price rises, for example, in oil, are not because the supply has been constricted yet, so that supply and demand are not wildly out of kilter yet. This is speculation on the basis of the fear that it might be. And so people who buy, companies who buy, countries who buy futures contracts in commodities like petroleum are nervous, and so they bid up the price of the futures contract. A lot of this is really very hard to predict right now, even if in the spot markets the prices have spiked dramatically in the last number of days. But again, I go back to the initial point that I was making, that it does you absolutely no good if you're an exporting country if you don't export because you don't earn anything from it. And if you don't earn anything from it, your own internal economic circumstances suffer. The usual term is you're cutting off your nose despite the rest of your face.
So what about ordinary Russians? Today we heard about Coca-Cola, as I mentioned, McDonald's, as well as Starbucks withdrawing their services, businesses in Russia. Will the withdrawal of some of these global companies hurt Russia or its ordinary citizenry? Is this something that's more symbolic in terms of impact?
Well, I think there are three reasons why companies like McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Pepsi or any number of other companies now, is a very long list at this point. They're doing it for several reasons. One of them, of course, is the increasing difficulty in even the impossibility of negotiating their way through the financial crisis that the rupture in the financial world, as far as Russia is concerned, has been created. They export, they import, they have to remit monies, they have to make payments. If you can't do it, it makes your business very difficult to run. That's number one. Number two, it's out of a sense of nervousness about how customers, suppliers, and consumers everywhere else will respond when they hear that you as a company are making money in Russia even now, that you're continuing to operate business. So it's a fear of the customer base all over the rest of the world. But the third reason is, it's kind of hard to find the heart or the soul of a major company, but they have to think about their larger image in the future as well. And so they're taking that into consideration. I think all of these companies are working on the assumption that at some point, whether it's weeks or months from now, they will be able to resume operations. And in your lead-in, you noted that the McDonald's people are continuing to pay the salaries of local employees in Russia. That says they don't plan to disappear from Russia. They simply want to cease business for a temporary period until things are sorted out.
Is there a long-term impact for some of these companies due to their exposure to the Russian market? And what about long-term exposure despite whatever plans that Russia had made to buffer itself from more sanctions, more severe sanctions?
Well, there's obviously going to be a long-term impact. I mean, just exactly what that is going to be is still hard to judge. But I think and I wouldn't be so foolish as to say it will be this thing or that thing or the other thing. But I would make this more general comment that it is going to make a lot of companies, whether they're American or British or Norwegian or Danish or whomever, it's going to make them a lot more cautious about building into their corporate planning further investments in Russia. You'll notice that some of the oil giants have pulled out of relationships or are busy getting out of relationships with Russia. Giants that have had relationships that have already run 30-some years, and so many millions, billions of dollars have been sunk into that, and now they are simply saying we're just going to have to cut our losses from this. What that means is that the international trading and system and the international economy there's going to be a lot more caution on the part of companies about expansion in Russia, a lot more caution about joint ventures, and a lot more caution about being tied to Russian supplies of whether it's natural gas or manganese or nickel or anything else. And that is, all that's going to spin out over the next months and years. It's not going to be something that's solved even if the war ends tomorrow morning.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Brooks Spector is Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick.